Welcome to the Daily MBA, where business wisdom is served fresh and fast, straight from one of the top MBA programs in the world. I'll give you summaries of my lectures and readings, as well as the most important insights gained from an MBA, so you can apply all of this knowledge in every business. Let's get started. In today's episode, we're going to be diving deeper into the first step of business analysis, and this is going to be strategic analysis. So what we want to understand here is what is a firm's core strategy and how is it behaving in this specific industry that the firm is operating. And why is this going to be important for doing a business analysis? Well, you are going to see that there is a lot of importance on the industry that a company is operating, because if we start doing just financial analysis, this is not going to be useful if we don't have a context in which we're doing all of these operations. Financial analysis is always going to be more effective when it's done within the firm's strategic context. So all of the strategy frameworks are going to be very useful for understanding the industry profitability and then compare if this company is actually better than its competitors. So all of the frameworks that you can consider and all of the ones that I mentioned in my strategy episodes are going to be very, very useful. For example, Michael Porter's 5 Forces framework or the generic competitive strategies frameworks that I said. So there are companies that are going to be aiming for cost leadership like Walmart, or there are some other companies that want differentiation like Whole Foods if we want. So we're always going to have to see what is the firm's strategy, because this is going to let us know what to look for in their financial statements, and then understand how this industry behaves. So I would suggest these 2 frameworks for starting: Michael Porter's 5 Forces and the generic competitive strategies. Once you know all of these things, we're going to go into the generic ways of creating value. So we want to understand if the company that we're analyzing is going to be a category leader, a consolidator, a customizer, a premium player, a solution provider, a low cost, or a value producer. So we have the 7 big buckets where we can start placing our firm, and this is going to give us also hints on what to expect in their financial statements. So if I know, for example, that I'm going to be studying a company such as Walmart that is aiming for a low cost strategy, I already know that what they want is going to be operational efficiency. But if I am analyzing a premium player, I won't be looking for this super efficiency, but how are they positioning this? And all of this industry tweaks, let's say, are going to have different impacts on the financial statements. But so first thing is understanding what is the firm's strategy. And with all of the frameworks that I just gave to you, you can kind of create an image on your head of the strategy of the firm and how it's going to be positioned in the industry. But so this is only the first part. Now we have to move on to the second part of the strategic analysis that's going to be creating industry generalizations. And so why is this important? Different industries are going to have very distinct financial statement patterns that are going to be generated with variations in the business models, in the capital intensity and market dynamics, and so and so. So over here, it's very important to understand what are these nuances in each industry. And so I'm going to give you some generalizations, but again, take all of these ones as generalizations, because there may be companies that are outliers if they are deciding to take a different approach in this industry. But most of the times we're going to be seeing some industries behaving similarly in their financial statements. So I'll give you an example, and this is going to be my first industry because it's very easy to understand. It's heavy industry or manufacturing. So if you have a company that you want to analyze in the manufacturing space or in the heavy industry, what you are going to expect is, of course, a very high PPE, which means high property, plant, and equipment. Why is this? Because all of the heavy industry and manufacturing companies are going to be capital intensive. They are going to have operations that require machinery or physical facilities. So they are going to have very high numbers of PPE. And if they don't have it, then this would be something that you want to be looking out for. Another thing that they usually have very high, it's going to be CapEx. So these are capital expenditures, which means how much money they are investing into this PPE. So of course, it has to be high because there must be regular or substantial spending on new equipment and on the maintenance of the old equipment. Other thing that you might expect is going to be low gross margins. And why is this? Because often this type of industry is going to operate as a price taker because they are in very competitive markets, and this leads them to have lower margins. So if you see a low margin in the industry, it wouldn't be a bad sign, right? Because it's just an industry generalization. And the fourth element is going to be that you'll expect high depreciation. Because again, we were talking about high amount of PPE. So if you have large assets, they're going to start depreciating over time, and this is going to impact the income statement with substantial depreciation expenses. So this is the perfect example of how you're going to be expecting to see things in the financial statements based on the industry. I'm going to keep sharing more generalizations, but now let's go into the retail and consumer goods. So this type of companies are going to, most of the times, have very high inventory. Why? Because they have significant inventory levels that they are selling all of the time, and this is going to be their source of revenue. But what companies want to aim for, at least most of the retail and consumer goods, is a quick turnover. So this could be something that you're looking for. Another factor that you might see is going to be very high revenue with lower margins, because these companies are going to have a lot of competitive pricing pressure, and even though they might be earning a lot of money, they are not going to be keeping all of this money because they have to hand it into suppliers or other parts of the supply chain, so it's not going to be staying as high. And the third factor that I usually like to generalize is that they're going to have low accounts receivable and high accounts payable. Because again, I was telling you that all of these big companies are operating in a complex supply chain. So if they're going to be doing all of these deals with their suppliers or with their sellers, they are going to keep little amount of the money, and most of the times they're not going to find the best deals. So low accounts receivable and high accounts payable.
¿Dónde están los $5 millones que me robaste?
Gloria tendrá que encontrar el dinero. Su vida y la de su hijo dependen de ello.
Hay que acorralar a la viuda.
¡Tengo mucho miedo, mamá!
El peor de los caminos será el único posible.
A mí no me importa ir a la cárcel con tal de salvar a mi hijo.
En la nueva superserie de Telemundo,
Esta mujer es clave. Que empiece la cacería.
La Jefa. Martes 18 de febrero a las 10:09 Centro por Telemundo.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA.
Now, if we move on to generalizations of the financial services, this one is going to be very, very particular, because bank statements are going to be analyzed in a different way than all of the other statements that we have. But I'll go into that in another episode. For now, what I want to generalize is that all of the financial services are going to have very high receivables, because either loans or insurance premiums are going to create receivables that are going to be appearing in the company's account. Then another thing that we can generalize is that the revenue is going to come from interest or fees. So this is going to depend, of course, in each company, but the interest income that comes from loans, fees, or the premiums is going to be the most prominent one when we're looking at the financial services. And the third thing that we're going to see in this type of companies is going to be complex liabilities, because liabilities are going to take the form of deposits, or insurance companies have long-term policy liabilities. So this is going to be looking very weird in financial services companies, and that's why all of the financial statements of financial services companies are going to be a little bit harder to analyze. Okay, now The next category that I want to explore in the industry is going to be branded companies. So these are companies that are going to create most of their value with their brand. And here you can get a little bit intertwined with all of the other categories that I was saying, because for example, a branded company might be Nike, but they are actually a clothing company. So you might get intertwined, but when I'm talking about branded companies, we're going to find some generalizations on all of the companies that are making a lot of the money based on their brand, like Apple. So here, these types of companies are going to have high gross margins because they have this strong brand power that is going to allow them to have premium pricing and therefore lead to higher margins. Another thing that they have is going to be significant advertising and marketing expenses. Because they didn't create this brand as easily, of course, they need large marketing budgets to maintain this brand and to acquire the customer loyalty. So all of these companies that have a big brand are also going to have big expenses on their marketing and ads. And of course, all of that is going to lead to high SG&A expenses. So all of these costs that are associated to building a brand, managing a brand, distribution networks, and global operations, they're going to be included in these types of companies. So that's why I consider branded companies as an industry, let's say, that you can generalize about. Another type of firms that you could study would be professional services. And so this one is going to be very interesting because professional services such as consulting firms, they are not going to have on their statements their biggest asset, because the biggest asset of a professional services firm is going to be their human capital. And human capital is not an asset and is nowhere in the financial statements. So that is one thing that you'll have to see. They won't have a lot of assets on the first place. But if you go into their costs, you would expect to see high employee costs. Because again, their most valuable asset is going to be human capital. And it's not going to be in the balance sheet, but it's going to appear as an expense in the income statement. And also, in addition to this, you won't expect to see any professional services firm with PPE or CapEx, all the things that I was telling you in the heavy industry ones. Here you won't have it because, again, the focus is going to be on human capital rather than on physical assets. So all of the asset part of a professional services firm is going to look a little bit distorted, but this is not something that you should worry about, just something that you should keep in your head. Now, if we go to the last two industries that I want to generalize about, the first one would be telecommunications. And so this industry is going to have very high fixed costs and PPE because they need to do investment in infrastructure like the networks, the towers, and the satellites. And so this is going to lead to higher levels of PPE usually. They also have usually very high debt levels because these teleco companies are often financed through substantial debt because it's a very capital intensive project. And the last thing that you should be looking for, at least in telco, is going to be a source of recurring revenue because these companies usually receive steady cash from monthly subscriptions. So these are things that you could be looking for. And now my last industry where I can do some generalizations is going to be technology and software. And so this one again, it's going to be an industry that is very particular because software or technology is technically not going to be an asset. So their financial statements are going to be looking also a little bit weird. First, you can expect to see a very high R&D because these technology companies are usually spending on innovation in order to maintain their competitive advantage. So this is going to be a very high expense that sometimes may look weird, but it's a positive sign in this case. You might, again, expect to see low PPE and low CapEx because similar to professional services, they won't have a lot of assets. Instead, they're going to have either human capital or intangible assets that can't be on the balance sheet, such as software, for example. A third thing that you would expect to see is going to be high gross margins, because once products are developed or software is developed, for example, production costs are going to be very low. And this is going to result in very high margins, because once the product is done, they're going to be earning a lot of money over that same product. And the last thing that you should be looking for, again, is going to be a thing called deferred revenue. So deferred revenue is going to be common when you have subscription models, because the revenue is going to be recognized over the service period rather than at sale. So all of the companies that are selling things with subscription, let's say Netflix, they are going to have to follow some accounting practices in order to recognize their revenue when you are using their service instead of when they're selling you. So this is going to affect a little bit their financial statements, but since most of the tech companies are working with subscription models, it is something that you should consider, because this deferred revenue model is going to be present in most of them. So I hope I didn't confuse you by giving you all of these generalizations, but hopefully it's just showing you some of the things that you should be looking for in their financial statements. So to summarize again, the first thing that you should do in strategic analysis would be looking at the firm's strategy, their current strategy, how is it operating? And then the second thing would be looking at its industry and then trying to find the generalizations on those statements. If you do this, basically you have already done the first step of business analysis. And in my next episode, we're going to continue with the further steps. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend so we can spread the knowledge and they can also learn more MBA concepts. Also, tell me in the comments what you thought of this episode, or give me a review if you liked it, because this is really helpful for me and it truly motivates me to keep teaching and sharing all of this knowledge with you. And stay tuned, because I'll see you next week in order to keep learning about accounting analysis.